أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Radio 786 on 100.4 FM. Tonight, we bring you a special tribute to Imam Ahmed Cassiem, recognized for his unwavering dedication to the struggle against apartheid, his tireless efforts to promote a deeper understanding of Islam, and an always a very unique political perspective, one who made the concept of justice, dare I say, a thesis of life. And so throughout his journey, he displayed this immense courage, the resilience, and even since his passing on Friday last week, he remains, as we've now established, a symbol of strength and determination.
Many anti-apartheid activists, Imam Ahmed Cassiem became politicized in his youth. The District 6-born Cassiem joined the armed struggle when he was just 15, and 2 years later he was arrested for his resistance activities. During his incarceration, Cassiem was interrogated and denied access to a lawyer or his family. He also attained his matric certificate and bachelor's degree in philosophy while in detention. It was during this time that he became an advocate for political prisoner rights. He attempted to alert the International Red Cross and Amnesty International of the torturous conditions on Robben Island. On his release around 1979, Cassiem founded the Qibla movement. The organization used a cell system to ensure secrecy even amongst its members. The strategy served to protect its members and their operations in the fight to bring down the apartheid regime. However, Qibla was still seen as a militant group even after the 1994 elections. It was the only group to consistently keep the memory of anti-apartheid activist Imam Abdullah Haroon alive. South Africa's transition from apartheid to a democratic and inclusive society also saw the formation of the Islamic Unity Convention. More than 300 Muslim organizations across the country joined the IUC with a vision to uplift this community. Cassiem is largely credited for leading the ideological direction of this grouping. The IUC either established or brought several organizations under its umbrella. This included aid organization Mustadafin, Iqra, Al-Miftah, and broadcaster Radio 786. Cassiem's teachings through his humanology classes saw the ideology of justice and education spreading throughout each of these organizations. The IUC was also amongst the first Islamic organizations to advocate for women to take on leadership positions, which was rare for Muslim organizations in the early 90s. Under his leadership and his resistance connections, the IUC hosted a winter university that was attended by renowned thinkers, including Russian philosopher Haider Jamal and French philosopher and resistance fighter Roger Garaudi. Despite the rights attained in 1994, Cassiem called for Muslims to boycott the country's first democratic elections. He argued that the compromises made by the ANC violated the goals of the anti-apartheid struggle. Cassiem remained critical of the ANC and called for South Africa's new democracy to secure justice for the victims of apartheid before rushing towards peace. Many argued that the government's push for the reverse has entrenched and deepened inequality in South Africa. In 2005, Cassiem led the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, in the Western Cape and was a strong proponent for the liberation of Palestine, often addressing the Quds rally demanding South Africa severing the ties with Zionist Israel. He was the author of several books, including The Begging Bowl, Hunger, Starvation, Malnutrition and Muslims, as well as Zionist Israel, Hypocrisy Has No Limits. But until his end, Cassiem, a teacher by profession, it was education that drove him. In 2015, he authored the book, The Oldest Profession, calling for the need to revolutionize education. Imam Ahmed Cassiem, 1945 to 2023.
And he passed away on a Friday morning, the early hours of Friday morning on the 14th of July at his home in Lansdowne after prolonged complications with his health. And as we have witnessed over the last couple of days and hours, that tributes have been pouring in from across the country, even from the office of the President of the Republic of South Africa, in which the President had to say Imam Cassiem lived a life of courage, principle and faith in mobilizing communities on the Cape Flats around the country against apartheid. President Ramaphosa went on to say that imprisonment, confinement to his home in Hanover Park, and the repeated harassment and detention by the apartheid security machine failed to extinguish the flame of resistance and revolution that burned in his being, which he ignited, and everyone was inspired as an activist. And President Ramaphosa concluded by saying that we are joined by the supporters of a struggle in Libya, Iran and other nations who had an impact on Imam Ahmed Cassiem, who in turn had an impact on them. We are grateful for his life and wish him eternal and a peaceful rest. That's the statement released by President Cyril Ramaphosa in the wake of the death of Imam Ahmed Cassiem. And so we tonight will have a special lineup of guests that will share with us a deeper insight into the life and the legacy of Imam Ahmed Cassiem. If you want to be one of them, feel free to send me a text message or a voice note on the number 0786 10 11 12, 0786 10 11 12. And as we mark this special occasion, I couldn't help but notice it's nearly 45 years since the establishment of Qibla, 1981 or so, around July, when all of this did happen. And it was Imam Ahmed Cassiem, together with other students of Imam Abdullah Haroon, that came together to theorize, as I understand it, around the name and what this mass movement will most definitely be. Sheikh Saadullah Khan is certainly, one such person that had been in that inner circle as Qibla came to be formed in the early 1980s. And I do now have Sheikh Saadullah Khan on the line with me. Assalamu alaikum to you, Sheikh, and shukran very much for having joined us this evening. I suppose it's been quite a weekend filled with lots of memories about this journey that you've walked with Imam Ahmed Cassiem. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
What is your sense on the Sunday evening about all of these memories? Having from the get-go, trying to establish, I suppose, a sense of a vision or a sense of leadership to lead the Muslim community. And this was, of course, pre-1981, but even post-1981.
Yeah, I think Imam Ahmed Cassiem, of course, was instrumental in the formation of the Qibla organization, and with other people, the Istiqman Road Masjid, like Imam Seb Davis and other people. But I think the whole idea was the crystallization of the thought of the, having a Quranic perspective on dealing with the struggle against injustice, particularly in our land and beyond our land as well. And the idea was to have a principled stand, not one which is too compromising in any way, and to take a stand which, as the Imam always mentioned, the importance of adl and qist, about the different dimensions of justice, and that we find that throughout his life, he was primarily a teacher. He was a genuine human being. I mean, I was very honored to be with him the night, a few hours before he passed away, reading some Quran to him on the Thursday night, and of course reading Shahada and repeating the Shahada. But 2 days before that, I was also with him, and in fact, he was whispering the Shahada as I was reading it with him and for him, and he actually whispered that. And I thought to myself, he was a great man from whose mouth and these very lips, which we hear the Shahada being recited, was a man who, though very strong in his perspective, very adamant about his views, at the same time very, very principled in his stance. And as I was saying at the Janaza, that, though we differed somewhat with him, and we may differ amongst ourselves regarding him, but one thing is for sure, throughout his life, he was a calm, collected man who had a very principled stand, and a person who was not necessarily very aggressive in his approach, but uncompromising in his perspective, and but at all times the well-being and the interest of the oppressed at heart. And I think when I look at my coming to Cape Town, I initially came to Stekhman Road Masjid, and the idea at that time was, after I finished my studies, was to lead prayer in the mihrab of Imam Abdullah Harun. And I went for a conference, a unity conference, and I was representing the youth in West Africa, the unity conference. And I was in touch with people who were from Stekhman Road, and I requested that could I come in, I want to stay in the mihrab of Imam Abdullah Harun. I'm completing my law studies here in Durban, and I would like to come in, and be. And that is where I got involved with Imam Ahmed Cassiem and those people around him, Imam Davids and others as well, and got involved, so to say, was one of the speakers very often on the Qibla platform and other platforms as well.
But do you believe that that sort of, I suppose, leadership and seeing a place, because if one, of course, tracks his movements from even before Qibla was established through the Muslim Youth Movement and others, to which he had some, I suppose, orientation with. He attended some of their programs, etc., but felt that we needed an organization with a lot more clarity, an organization that's able to lead the Muslim community. And a lot of it, of course, had been, I suppose, somewhat inspired by the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and then of course later we saw, in the sort of in the early 80s, an organization that says that there's a place for Muslims to play here, but that Muslims need to be ideologically clear about what its role is in resisting oppression, and that seems to have been the premise for what made Qibla and subsequent organizations and emerging Muslims that came from that sort of thought very clear about what constitutes the oppressor and the way in which then to resist that oppression.
Yeah, I think it was very much also aligned with the Pan-Africanist approach, of Africa for the Africans, and it was nothing to do with color or to do with race, as you know. But I think the whole notion, obviously, people like Ibrahim Badin and people like Tahir Levy could maybe tell you, and even those father was imam at this co-imam, or rather assistant imam, were under in those days at the Muir Street Masjid and so on, would tell you, of course, there was tremendous influence of the MYM and those initial organizations that influenced him tremendously. Of course, his teachers at Trafalgar High School, Sadiq Isaacs and other people as well. But you are very correct when you are saying that the whole idea was to find ideological clarity, because very often as you emerge, you become not proactive, but rather reactionary, and you go with the flow. And that's a danger, because sometimes you overcompromise on things. And I think this was the issue. That at times it seemed that they were aloof from engaging, for example, there was a complete refusal to negotiate with the existing apartheid regime at that time, and so on. It was seen almost as a betrayal, and it was because the idea was you become diluted in your struggle, and I think this was the issue, and this is what I saw as well when I engaged with him, and I think that was the ideological clarity that the Qibla and those circles wanted to put forth. I mean, even you find the new unity movement, new unity movement, they were neither PAC or ANC at that time either, but there was a degree of conciseness in how they thought and how they spoke and how they articulated what they said, and it led to less, I believe, opportunity for compromise.
Yeah.
No, I don't say you mustn't negotiate and discuss with people necessarily, but I'm talking about principles. Very often you cannot distinguish eventually who the oppressor and the oppressed was, and I think that's part of the reason why we are in the dilemma we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Color has changed, but the powers that be and the colonialist forces and the imperialist forces who had access and control and monopoly over the resources still have it. And I think that was the issue. Not so much the idea of being a separate organization or different, but ideological clarity and how you deal with this. And the very fact that we are where we are right now is a clear indication of how correct that approach was. I don't say everything about it was perfect or correct, but the need for that kind of stance, which
And
you
I think
so
especially at that particular moment, there was
yes,
that, and even post 1994, the role
yes.
of Muslims in the discourse that was coming to craft together a new democratic dispensation. Sheikh, thank you very much for coming onto the program this evening. Sheikh Saadullah Khan, one of the members that was part of the band of the Imam Abdullah Harun students that came together and formed Qibla, as it were. And in fact, Sheikh Saadullah Khan, led the Janazah Salah and the burial of Imam Ahmed Cassiem, to whom we are paying tribute this evening. And it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the Imam's father, whose name was Ahmed Cassiem. He was fondly referred to as Buta Cassiem in Hanover Park. He was an endearing figure, quite profound in planting ideology in a very simple manner. He, for instance, focused a lot on Tawheed and fiqh. Not so much the fiqh, but the tawheed and in the oneness of God and what that had particularly represented. Of course, it's important to note that Imam Ahmed Cassiem's father had been, I suppose, exposed and theologically trained by the likes of Sheikh Ismail Khanif al-Azhari, which, by the way, was also the teacher of Imam Abdullah Harun. And quite interestingly, on a Friday evening, they used to have these programs where they used to recite the Quran. There were these jalsas of some sort, and the warsh that took place on a Friday. And so the 50s and the 60s were characterized by Imam Ahmed Cassiem's father, Buta Cassiem, that they recited every Friday evening and concluded certainly with there was only 2 members or so that survived that, but there were a group of people that Imam Ahmed Cassiem had often recognized as being the foundation for his experience and Islamic exposure and teachings, etc. And that, of course, an ode to his father as well. But the Imam, was as a young person, he was very driven, very motivated. Remember, he was 15 years old or so when he kept on finding himself in the crosshairs of the apartheid regime. He was, at Trafalgar High School. He was part of the cultural society that existed there, and it was the editor of a school magazine called the Voice of Trafalgar. And Imam Ahmed Cassiem, was not just a Trafalgar. What do they call themselves? Trafalgarians. But he was at that particular school where it was Sadiq Isaacs that had, I suppose, molded him or taught him or led him, because he was a young man at the age of 15, very feisty, very determined that things don't seem right. Why is it that because I am from this color, you are from that color, that by virtue I am the oppressed and that I can't get opportunities? And it was that sort of crafting at a very young age that Sadiq Isaacs had played a role in mentoring the likes of Imam Ahmed Cassiem. And so during 1964, so at the age of 17, he was charged alongside Sadiq Isaacs under the Sabotage Act for having made bombs, and they both were then imprisoned thereafter shortly. And there was an intention at the time to blow up a electric substation, and they were, of course, sentenced to prison for this and that. And of course, the long journey with Sadiq Isaacs started then. And I am very honored and privileged this evening to speak to Auntie Maraldia Isaacs, the wife of the late Sadiq Isaacs, who I also had the privilege of attending his janazah a couple of years ago. And we, of course, like us that are sitting here today, but there are very many other anti-apartheid fighters that owe a great amount of gratitude to your late husband, Auntie Maraldia, for the role that he has played, not just in crafting the revolution in the way that he did, but also teaching them in prison at the time. And so, assalamu alaikum to you, and shukran very much for having joined us.
Inshallah.
I'd like to understand, what are your earliest memories of Imam Ahmed Cassiem?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I didn't know Ahmed Cassiem, but I knew his father.
Yeah.
I went with
Buta Cassiem.
Buta Cassiem.
Yeah,
we went on debates.
Okay.
From the MYM. We would go to Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and we'll go out, and he'll be there, and we'll all be there to support him.
Yeah.
And this is how I got to know Buta Cassiem, as we called him. He was my teacher, and he was also Ahmed's father. I didn't know Ahmed. I didn't meet Ahmed. I think that time Ahmed also went to the island.
Yes.
And I knew now, but I knew Sadiq.
Yeah.
And but I didn't know the connections with him.
Because everything was a secret at
At
that
what
time.
time, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was, my mother, them didn't know. Because, I was at school and he gave us maths and all that and then disappeared off to the island. I was fortunate to have gone to listen to the court case and that. And my father and mother was very upset when they got sentenced.
Yeah.
And I never then got to know until I got married and we had to go and see Ahmed.
Yeah.
And that's where my connection with Ahmed came. And Ahmed was very, very close.
And around about what age was this? Do you remember?
Well, the age when I got to him, he must have been in his 30s.
Okay.
Because I was 36.
Okay.
And he was a year older than me. So he was about 37.
And what was your impression about somebody that was so ideologically clear, that was so determined? I suppose there are very many other Robben Islanders that were equally as determined as he was, but here was this young man, Ahmed Cassiem's son.
Yeah, and he wanted a Muslim country.
Yeah,
and he always wanted to tell we're going to get this. I said, Ahmed, we can't have a Muslim country. We have to start with our family first. Start there, and then we can carry on. We can't just say we vote and we're going to have a Muslim country. It's not going to work. Ahmed and I had lots of problems,
debates and stuff.
But he would come to my husband, and everything, even the radio. When they started that, he came to discuss it with my husband, and they discussed everything. And he said, I'm sitting at the back because I would put my foot in the wrong place.
The impression sometimes that had always been created that these were a group of youngsters, as at the time that Imam had been imprisoned, that was just set on causing havoc and destruction, but that clearly wasn't the case.
It wasn't, no.
Because Imam also got his education.
Yes,
your late husband was teaching at that time, even in prison. And talk to me about why there seems to have been such a clear determination and such a very clear conviction from people like Imam Ahmed Cassiem.
My husband was, as I know, he was 24 when he went there, and Ahmed was 17. Dingaan Moseneke was 15.
Yeah.
He was the youngest, and my husband took them under their wing, and they all matriculated. And then when I spoke to Ahmed recently, well, a while ago, I said, Dingaan brought me his book, and he wrote such a lot about Siddiq. And he said, but that wasn't enough. You should have written much more. And I said, I don't know what you people did, but he wrote about, because I've got the book and every second page is about Siddiq. What Siddiq did to them and Siddiq did. So he said, it's not enough. I said, well, Ahmed, Siddiq is gone and you're still here. He, up till the last, when my husband got sick, I've never seen a person take somebody's death to heart as it was. And I took his death. It was like I'm burying my husband again.
Yeah.
When I was there, I watched
In
it.
the days up to Friday last week.
I was there all the time, closed his eyes and all. And it's the same. Let me tell you, Siddiq died 2nd Dhul Hajj. Ahmed died the 24th Dhul Hajj. Siddiq died Yawmil Jum'ah. Ahmed died Yawmil Jum'ah.
Sure.
So it is the same if it was a repeat of it.
I can't imagine what that must feel like for you.
I was very depressed. I was, they phoned me at 2 o'clock in the morning and sleep was finished to me.
Yeah.
Because I've even been accused by the security. Because when they stayed in Soetwatershoop, then Siddiq was behind the side and I would be going with the baby up the steps and down the steps. And they come to Siddiq and is she the to go between?
Yeah.
And not what I know of. And, afterwards, he's a very caring person, Ahmed. After Siddiq died, he would come there and he said, why are you walking? Why isn't you he got somebody to fix my gate. And he'd come and visit, are you okay? And when he was sick, I would go to the hospital. And it's a void to me now. There's no more Ahmed.
Yeah, as much as there's also no
there's
Sadiq as
Sadiq
well. And I sit, of course, at your feet, and I come to realize that this is as a generation of people that we're not fully going to, I suppose, we can't speak of them without realizing the enormous contribution and the level of sacrifice to which they've made. I mean, the same with Uncle Sadiq and yourself and the marriage, and how complicated and how upset your parents were at that time. The successive times when people like Ahmed Cassiem and others had been incarcerated purely for seeing more than one person at a time, etc., which was really silly. But there was these continued efforts to try and suppress them. What do you think? What made people like Ahmed Cassiem and your late husband so determined to keep the struggle going?
My husband never took with him. I would be very cross, and he'll say, I said, how can you entertain these people? What if they killed you and I'm not even at home? He said, no, I defy them. They must kill me first. He did everything that was in a way of
Justice,
fighting for justice. He said, do you know the story of Ahmed and in I don't if anyone know anyone when they were first arrested?
Can you share with us?
Yes, I can. There you go. He goes to Paulsmoor, Victor Festino.
Victor Festino.
And what's it? Not Victor Festino, Paulsmoor.
Yes.
They're there, and the idea of being in prison is to always try and escape.
Yeah.
That is the bottom line. Try and escape. So they were now 4.
Okay.
And they're now going to try and escape. Now, I've also learned what they did. Ahmed would sing, and Sadiq would file the trellis that's now there.
Yeah.
And when it was ready to push open, and there was somebody supposed to have been with a car outside.
Okay.
And somebody must have told them about this thing that when they took them away and they then go and knock on this thing to fall trali.
Oh, goodness.
And then they got tied down. But him and the other one, they were singing songs so that they didn't hear the noise. Now, this was all the type of things that they did on the island.
Yeah.
And they did here in prison.
So did you ever ask them what was the plan? After escaping prison, what was it, to swim back?
No, that was here.
That was Paulsmoor, right?
Paulsmoor.
But of course, those plans, I'm sure, tried to continue even at Robben Island.
Now, let me tell you of Robben Island.
Yeah.
Didn't you read it? Oh no, that part didn't come. When he was in Robben Island, Ahmed got 5 years. Sadiq got 12 years and 13 another year for making a key.
Okay.
Now you see, have you read his book?
Yes.
You see the book, there's a key on.
Yes.
Now that key is instrumental because that key was made by Jeff Mosamola.
Yeah.
And I can also make a key tomorrow because the key got lost between Robben Island and Cape Town because they get the apricot box with all the goodies. But his computer things that he did, his computers was not like this. It was a paper with all holes in it. I don't know what the devil, but that was supposed to be the first computers.
Yeah.
That's all little holes. I said, we have the first computer that they bought. It was about that size.
Yeah.
And then we got the Apple and we had this. But he was always into that. So I said, now, how did you make the cake? So they lost it. So 1994, they brought somebody there and said, it's now a museum. Can you do the key again?
Yeah.
So he said, yes. And we had the person that had Steeler. So he went over, he said, when you make a key, then you first got to make it, the candle, you make it black, and then you put the key in the shape. And then you take it out, and then you measure it, and then the first and the third and that. And the first one, why I got a X-ray here, is when they did the initial testing. So if they can't get anyone involved, Ahmad was gone, everyone. So Tony Susie was his best pal, and they were involved. So they had to wait till everyone is asleep.
In order to do this.
And then they got up and they tried the key. And it opened the door.
Wow.
And then they couldn't close it. And they couldn't get it out.
What a predicament.
And then they said, now, shall we leave it in or shall we take it out?
Yeah.
And they're now contemplating, and eventually they took it out. And nobody now knew about it. Out it went, and in it came again until it was a success. Now, what happened is the next morning, the warders came around and knocked. Then they're 6 o'clock, up, or 5 o'clock, up to it. But when he got to the gate, it was open. One turn and it was open. All there, and they now sit, they locked them up, and 3 triple time, and he went to the official. And he said the previous one didn't lock the door properly. And off they went. Then they didn't see that one again, and they asked, what happened to them? No, he's been accused of being negligent. Because he...
And if only they knew about this key, this infamous key.
And then Ahmad when Ahmad came, Ahmad started, when Qibla is established after they came out of the island. And they discussed it a lot. By my house was lots of meetings with Qibla, with this radio things, and Sadiq would give them advice, and Ahmad would take that advice, and I always wondered what was going to come of it.
I'm running out of time, and of course it's important to know that your late husband, Sadiq, Uncle Sadiq, not only mentored people like Ahmed Cassiem, but also ended up teaching, if my memory serves me correctly, people like Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, President Jacob Zuma, and very many others that had been all Robben Islanders at the time. I wanna ask you, Timaldia, whether you think the public, those that wasn't so close to your husband and to Imam Ahmed Cassiem and others, do you know whether we as the public realize the immense psychological impact that they went through with the mannerisms in which they had been interrogated, the ways in which they were tortured, the way in which they were sent to hard labor, etc. What sort of impact did that have on people like Imam Ahmed Cassiem, your husband Sadiq Isaacs, and others?
What do you mean, the impact that their torture? When Sadiq first came out, he didn't speak a lot. He was very quiet, very withdrawn, all that. And I thought he would never get right. But when the children came around, they broke that feeling that they have that's isolated. But there's still one thing that he complained about, was coldness.
Yeah.
The coldness of the island.
Yeah.
That he'll always close himself up because Ahmad too. The cold I felt on the island. It was extremely cold. And then Ahmad went for the second time. And he got the second time when he was arrested again.
Yeah.
And I said, Ahmad, couldn't you stay? He said, no, I had to stay. I had to go back.
Yeah.
And that was him. He had the willpower of wanting to go back.
May Allah grant him a Jannah and reward for all of his sacrifices. Ultimately, shukran to you for coming out this evening to come and talk to us about.
I hope I did justice to it.
No, indeed, you've given us so much to think about and to reminisce about those memories. And also, thank you so very much. I'm sure you have had to make lots of cups of teas, and when those conversations happened late at night.
And it's still all that. And what I'm saying is, our people, our Muslim community, don't think anything of anyone going to the island.
Yeah.
They really think nothing of it. I'll take you, they've made the film more than just a game, which is based on Robben Island. Not one of the Muslims here of Cape Town went and buy it, went and see it. Robben Island's there, so what?
Yeah.
We've got a different attitude to people that's political.
Had it not been for that, I don't quite know where we would be today. And people like your late husband, to whom we owe a great amount of gratitude for having shaped a lot of these anti-apartheid fighters. Mardia, shukran very much.
Okay, inshallah, and you are?
Tashriq, shukran very much for coming
inshallah. Now, you're welcome to come for your cup of tea.
I will indeed, inshallah.
Bring your five children.
Bet you I will. I love a nice history lesson, and I look forward to doing just that. Mardia,
inshallah.
Shukran very much for coming on to the program this evening. Mardia Isaacs, the wife of the late Siddiq Isaacs, and of course a great friend and a confidant of Imam Ahmed Cassiem, to whom we are paying tribute to this evening here on Radio 786. It's gone 10 minutes before 7 o'clock. Coming up, we'll talk to a whole host of other figures. Hanif Hendricks, the leader of the Al Jama'ah Party, will be on the program very shortly, as well as Professor Muhammad Haroon. We also have Reverend Dr. Alan Busak that will be on the program a bit later, including Imam Ismail Davids and Sister Magboeba Davids, the PRO for the Islamic Unity Convention, and an ardent, learner at the feet of Imam Ahmed Cassiem. That and more coming up here as we continue to pay special tribute to Imam Ahmed Cassiem.
I have served 11 years under banning orders because of the Internal Security Act and Terrorist Act and Sabotage Acts. 11 years on Robben Island for violating those laws. I therefore am a classical example of a terrorist. Who did I terrorize? My job was to terrorize the oppressor, and I have no regrets about that.
That Imam Ahmed Cassiem talking about that if I was a terrorist, and I have no regrets because my purpose was to terrorize the oppressor. Such strong ideological clarity there in one of the speeches he had delivered. Let's now go to Hanif Hendricks, one of the founding members of the Muslim Students Association, a lecturer as well as the founder of the leader of the Al Jama'ah Party, joining us now for some insight into the political life that certainly was quite intricate for Imam Ahmed Cassiem. Brother Hanif, assalamu alaikum, and shukran very much for joining us here on Radio 786.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Just having listened there to Auntie Mardia Isaacs, the wife of the late Siddiq Isaacs, and of course good confidant and friend of Imam Ahmed Cassiem, telling us how complicated and intricate a lot of these discussions had been about formulating essentially a new Muslim discourse in the country, because there's been quite a bit of evidence about a group of Muslims, I suppose, that had often just gone along with the convention, the convention of what was the then normal. But it was people like Imam Ahmed Cassiem, others, yourself, and so on, that had very long conversations and journeys about how to craft a different Muslim discourse, and one that was quite clear about resisting oppression. To talk us through those experiences.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you know, that Imam Ahmed Cassiem was finally released on the same day that Imam Abdullah Haroon was murdered while in detention. And, that is a dramatic coincidence. You refer to the discourse, and we all know that the Imam played a very important role in the liberation struggle. He did not neglect or forget the community that he comes from. And that's why one of the first things that he did on the eve of 1994 was to invite every known Muslim organization to come together and decide the way forward. And I remember that everyone got a registered letter to attend a conference, and well over 300 attended out of the 1,000 that we expected. About 1,000 invitations were sent out. What was very interesting is that soon after the idea was that once there's an Islamic Unity Convention, they need to plot the way forward as far as taking a more active part in the political life of the country. So today and the past week, since the Imam's death, there has been tributes, and I must thank Radio 706 for also allocating some time to pay a tribute to him. But Imam Ahmed Cassiem doesn't need any tributes. He doesn't need obituaries. He has left a legacy behind. And trying to unite the Muslims is one of the legacies that he left behind. So once an Islamic structure was in place for the Islamic Unity Convention, the next effort was to look at the proposed constitution that was going to govern South Africa. And there was a constitutional assembly. Imam Ahmed Cassiem and his legal team and some of us spent hours and hours, days and days, going through every clause. And he virtually rewrote the constitution that he felt would suit South Africa going forward. We made the submissions to the Constitutional Assembly. Ahmed Cassiem went one step further. He submitted the amendments to the proposals of the Constitutional Assembly to every member of Parliament. I remember we had to put it in everyone's pigeonhole. So the lawmakers at the time knew exactly what the thinking was. And many of the issues that Imam Ahmed Cassiem, with the assistance of his legal team and the executive, raised, we are suffering because it wasn't accepted. For example, Imam Ahmed Cassiem felt that there shouldn't be access to water. There should be a right to water. And also the same with basic services and electricity and housing. And he felt that access to basic services was a colonial construct. You can't give people a guarantee access and they're going to walk 10 kilometers for a pail of water. So we can see today that if they accepted the proposals that he put on the table, the country wouldn't have been in a mess that it is today. And then, of course, he played a very important role. He felt that the airwaves need to be freed. And for 5 years, Imam Ahmed Cassiem spent days and days putting together applications to get Radio 706 a permanent license. So as a PRO, it was my job to do the presentation. They only give you 40 minutes, and you have a 300-page document to try and put to the ICASA members. He didn't give up for the first year, temporary license, second temporary, and we continued until we got a permanent license. That's the kind of energy that he had. He made the effort. And the problem today is that Muslims don't make the effort. They don't make the effort to bring about true liberation. They don't make an effort to bring about dramatic socio-economic changes, which he proposed in the constitution that he drafted.
Yeah.
So today the Muslims are largely still disunited. There's no single voice that speaks for the Muslims. And if only the South African government listened to the Constitutional Assembly listened to his amendments. If only the Muslims took a more active role in the Islamic Unity Convention, we would not have been shortchanged.
Yeah.
Africa would have been a better country.
And that's an important point that you make, because some of the literature around Qibla, for instance, was quite critical to say that that it failed to develop organic links with other groups in Cape Town's growing civil society. That Qibla fell short of gaining mass appeal among Muslims in the Cape and elsewhere, because quite clearly, there were quite a bit of people, I suppose, as part of Muslim community, that quite did not feel the necessity to embark on the struggle and with the determination that people like Imam Ahmed Cassiem and others did. And so that is a very crucial point that you are making there. I am loath to indicate that we're running out of time. In fact, we are out of time because the Isha is coming up. So I'm going to, of course, thank you very much for coming onto the program this evening. Khalid Vendricks, leader of the Al Jama'ah Party, but his background and his association with Imam Ahmed Ahmed Cassiem goes far and beyond just him being the leader of Al Jama'ah, having been part of the Radio 786 of the Islamic Unity Convention, part of Qibla as well. That Hanif Hendricks has a very long story to tell, and we had a snippet of that on this evening's program. Thank you very much, Hanif Hendricks. To Radio 786 on 100.4 FM. It's a special tribute to the late Imam Ahmed Cassiem. I'd like now to welcome Professor Muhammad Haroon, the son of the late Imam Abdullah Haroon. And Professor Haroon, of course, is widely known as a theologian. He's also the director of the International Relations Desk at IPSA. And this evening, reflecting certainly on Imam Ahmed Cassiem and also the key concepts that the Imam had lived by. Professor Haroon, assalamu alaikum. Shukran very much for having joined us. I'd like to maybe just reflect on the overlap between what your late dad had represented and, of course, now the emergence of a Qibla, of an Imam Ahmed Cassiem as an almost as an organic continuation of the foundation set by people like your father. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think starting off on that comparative note, I think is indeed important. Interestingly, just before we go further, is that on the very day my father was killed, the Imam was released from incarceration, and that in a speech that he gave in Salt River, that is, I'm talking about Imam Ahmed Cassiem, he somewhat noted that fateful connection, so to speak. And so it resonates sort of very deeply in terms of both being anti-apartheid activists, both being homegrown Cape Townians who grew up in apartheid, who lived through the times and who witnessed what was happening, and who basically used their understanding, of course, applying their minds to the situation they were in, drawing from the Quran, drawing from the prophetic example, and giving it a meaning within context. So when looking at both, when they read the Quran with meaning, with understanding, as Ahmed would try to emphasize, it is those ideas come to the fore. In other words, for him, of course, in the case of Ahmed Cassiem, the meaning that you extract from the ayah, whichever ayah it might be, and is sort of important, and applying it in the context becomes more important, partly because of the racist, inhumane system that we were residing in. And so he continues basically where the Imam had, in a sense, left off. Not that he continued then, he already started before then, or during the time when the Imam was active in the township. So, of course, upon his release, he was a man of steel, if I can describe him in that way, partly because he was fearless. He was articulately fearless when it comes to the apartheid system, and they knew him to be like that, somebody whom they were unable to break down, somebody whom they were not able to counter in whichever way, whether verbally or in any other way. So the Imam Ahmed Cassiem really stood out and, of course, continued right until sort of his last days. I mean, he never wavered. He never changed his mind on issues. He was always firm and clear, crystal clear about the objective of being around and standing up against apartheid. And even in the post-democracy, he basically never stood back. He made it very clear as to what he saw. Wherever there was injustice, he would speak out. And that was, for me, and my understanding of Imam Ahmed Cassiem.
Yeah, and the reality is that, when some had used very vile language against your late father in describing his role in the townships and the resisting, and in fact himself also landing himself, through his efforts to liberate South Africa in incarceration and having died, in that particular circumstance, or under that circumstance, Imam Ahmed Cassiem was always quite clear in calling out this sort of mainstream discourse, claiming that, the sort of mainstream Islam had been too complacent. Instead of being vehemently opposed to the apartheid regime, they were generally silent fence sitters who are submissive and mild in the face against the oppressive state. I recall having read about, in the sort of post sort of the 1994 era in the Codesa, discussions that had taken place. Qibla was quite clear in maintaining a revolutionary posture. In fact, the text from some of that said that, it felt that Codesa had led to compromises and it was highly flawed and questionable. During the 1992, when Codesa was in session, Imam Ahmed Cassiem had clarified Qibla's stance by saying that there should be an intensification of the revolutionary violence to counter and stamp out other forms of violence. Muslims have contributed in the ideological sense of the concept of jihad, which means that they exert themselves to the utmost in order to attain a just social order, and therefore would have no truck with compromise with the enemy. And of course, that many felt, or some felt, was deeply ideological and not entirely pragmatic, but one cannot entirely deny the harshness of the truth in all of that and the consequence which we are witnessing today and living under today.
I think on these issues, he, as we both agree and I think generally understood, we're talking about an imam who was extremely clear, crystal clear in his mind, what needs to be targeted. And in this instance, of course, during the apartheid period, it was the apartheid system as a whole. No portion should be seen apart from the other. They're all a whole, and they should be tackled and responded to as a whole. So for him, two important qualities were sort of necessary, or rather three. One was to be sincere in one's effort to counter the system as best as you can with whatever you have. The second is one has to be fearless, like we mentioned earlier on. And this is partly his own experience whilst he was in prison, the way he was tortured, the way he was handled, and of course the way he saw his fellow prisoners also being handled. So it made him, instead of really causing him to cave in, it did the opposite. It only made him more firm and more focused to basically pursue a path that he felt was necessary to pursue. And of course, being armed with the Quran and his understanding, his reading of the Quran also helped him to shape his thoughts. And so the Quran itself laid that necessary foundation that he needed to really pursue some of the objectives. But I'll sort of come back to that in a moment. Let me just say the third one was that each of us, whoever, of course, then fought against the system, must be knowledgeable, must be informed, must be intellectually equipped to basically also deal with the type of institutions that we had to deal with. We cannot feign ignorance. We cannot ignore the fact that we need to know how they play their game and how we need to basically counter the game. So in other words, for him, these were sort of important ways and, of course, part of the method of countering the apartheid system.
Yeah.
And this is why he critiqued the leadership, whether it is the ulama or whether other individuals who belong to the colored representative council or any of these system sort of structures that existed. He critiqued them across the board. If I may just quickly quote more or less what he said. He said, my experience tells me that the first and foremost, the leadership must be sincere, a quality I just mentioned, and which he has really imbibed and demonstrated. And in fact, maybe just on that note, whoever wants to critique him can not at any point say that he was insincere. He made it fairly clear, and it came from his heart, from his whole being, when he expresses himself. And I think that is what stands out. And so let me just continue this. There must be a leadership and not merely leaders, because when you chop off the head of a leader, the movement collapses. But when you have a leadership they at least consolidate and continue the struggle, they must have the ideological clarity, and this phrase needs to underline, ideological clarity, which first and foremost means that they must have conceptual clarity, another, connecting phrase. And I find that it is a conceptual illiteracy, a point that you always made, that is a great problem in the general community. But conceptual confusion and conceptual illiteracy at the level of the leadership is unforgivable. I won't read further, but I think
that's a very important point that you make. Often having heard him talk about conceptual literacy, which is such an important, I think, point of conclusion, because at least for this part of our coverage, because without it, one quite is wasting one's time, without that conceptual literacy in understanding the purpose and more so what should drive that purpose, then I think we will indeed be a lost community. And I think those were one of his pioneering messages through his lifetime. And so thank you very much, certainly, for reminding us about that. We're out of time, and we could go on and on and on talking about these very important matters, but I'm going to have to go to the Waqt of Isha. So thank you very much for having come onto the program this morning, Professor Muhammad Haroon, the son of the late Imam Abdullah Haroon, and somebody that has interfaced with Imam Ahmed Cassiem, to whom we are paying tribute to this evening, quite a bit through his years, and highlighting some of the texts there as well that informed the discourse around Imam Ahmed Cassiem. Once we do return from the Waqt of Isha, we have Dr. Ellen Busak that will be joining me, and we'll talk a little bit about the Imam as an internationalist, somebody that not only was quite clear in the Palestinian struggle, but also the Kashmiri struggle, for instance. We'll talk a little bit about that and more just after the Waqt of Isha. Do stay with us. This is a continuation of a special legacy program, or a tribute that we are paying to the late Imam Ahmed Cassiem.
Just a few days ago, one elderly retired principal said to me, in the pre-Islamic era, and then I said, just wait a minute, when was that? When was God born?
Yeah.
And then she understood that there's been no period in man's life that can be called pre-Islamic, because they think Islam started with the birth of the Prophet or with the revelation of the Quran. But then the Quran itself says that Abraham and Moses and Jesus were all Muslims. They submitted to the will of God. So that is why I'm saying there's no necessity for Muslims, Jews and Christians to be fighting each other. They should be understanding what the revelation is about.
Yes.
And there's a very important principle which says that if you kill one innocent person, it's as if you've killed the whole of humanity. And if you save the life of one innocent person, it's as if you've saved the whole of humanity. And the Prophet Muhammad actually endorsed that very beautifully by saying that the best human being is the one who is most beneficial to humanity. Now, when we talk about a just social order, we mean one in which you are neither an oppressor nor oppressed. Now, doesn't that sound good? And it's a society in which every human being, citizen or non-citizen, has at least one